We are extremely honored to be hosting this event with One Day Sooner, with their CEO, Josh Morrison, and bioethicist, Charles Weijer. Josh is the founder of One Day Sooner, Waitlist Zero, and the Rikers Debate Project. One Day Sooner advocates on behalf of people who want to participate in a COVID-19 human challenge trial. So far, more than 38,000 volunteers have signed up. Charles is a bioethicist and an expert on the ethics of randomized controlled trials. He was a member of the WHO's Working Group for Guidance on Human Challenge Studies in COVID-19. We are so excited to discuss this important topic of such current relevance. Challenge trials for COVID-19 vaccine development seek to speed up the vaccine development process by infecting healthy volunteers with the virus once they have been vaccinated to be able to see how well the vaccine works. Today, the UK began its first massive vaccination program, which we all hope will be the beginning of the end of this crisis. These news, however, don't really undermine the importance of our conversation today about challenge trials, because while we are privileged in the UK to be able to access the first batch of vaccines, many poorer countries in the world are still relying on second or third generation vaccines, for whose development challenge trials may still be essential. Challenge trials are also very valuable to see how COVID infection, disease, and immunity work, which are all areas that are still puzzling scientists all around the world. Josh and Charles will now begin the debate, and after that, there will be time for questions and also discussion in breakout rooms. Please, can I remind you to fill in the pre-event survey? You can find the link or the QR code, and maybe we can also send the link on the chat if that isn't on already. And yeah, if there are any problems during the event, please just let me or AB or Glenda know via the chat. And yes, we will now hand it over to Josh, who will start with the for argument. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Blanca, for hosting. We really appreciate it here at One Day Sooner, having the opportunity to do this debate. And thank you, Charles, for agreeing to debate against. Really, I'm looking forward to this and have enjoyed our discussions in the past. So basically, my talk today is going to have kind of four main points. And the first point is that just kind of describing what challenge trials are historically, what they are in general, and making the point that they're a useful scientific tool that would be helpful to have in a pandemic. And then second, kind of making the argument that, looking at what the risks of participating in a challenge trial would be, and making the argument that those risks are meaningful, but also that they're of a level that we should allow people to consent to, and we allow people to consent to in other places. And then I want to look at, thirdly, that, if challenge trials had been developed with some urgency starting back in March, where would we be now, and how much better would that be? So the argument that would have been justified. And then looking forward, are challenge trials justified now, and arguing for some of the different uses we'd have for them. So starting with this kind of, well, what is a challenge trial in general? Like, what's the history here? What's the background? Why are they useful? And the main point to understand is challenge studies are a tool that are used across a wide variety of diseases that are absolutely essential in understanding those diseases. So the basic argument I'm trying to make here is that just like what our intuition should be, is that if we have this enormous pandemic that's this huge problem for humanity, we shouldn't give up having this important scientific tool to deal with that pandemic. So okay, what are some examples? Why is challenge trials useful historically? Well, the first thing to realize is that it's a unique opportunity to study a disease up close and to study how it works under controlled observation, right? So it's really difficult, if you think about it, from the very moment someone gets infected, to study the disease, because you don't know when people are getting infected, right? So let's say if you're trying to figure out how flu works, if 1% of people in a flu season or 5% might get infected every month, something like that, you would need to be taking a huge amount of medical data from thousands of people in order to actually spot the ones who are getting infected at any given time. It's completely impracticable. So what a challenge study is if you can observe the infection right away from the beginning, you can learn quite a bit about it. And so, for example, what's called a correlate of protection, the way we know if a flu vaccine is going to work ahead of time, if it gives your body this correlate of protection, the main one that we use for developing flu vaccines, which is the antigens, the HAI antibodies, I believe, That was something we discovered in challenge studies, I think in the 60s. If you look at what we know about coronaviruses, we know a lot about them from challenge studies on cold coronaviruses that were done in the 20th century as well. For example, how long it creates immunity for. So there are all these things we can learn, questions of duration of immunity, questions of how immunity works, things of, when are you infectious? When are you shedding the virus most? Maybe we could learn things about super spreaders, for example. Why are people, people shedding more virus? Is that why they're super spreaders? What kind of people are going to be super spreaders? Things like that. All these sorts of things you can learn. And then there's this issue that they're used for testing vaccines and treatments, because again, you can reliably observe, instead of waiting for 1% of your population to get infected every month, and so you need thousands of people to see if a vaccine or treatment is working, you can, use a challenge study where you're finding out if 80% of that population is. So you're getting much fewer numbers, much shorter period of time. And that's why they've been useful for developing the modern drugs that we use for flu or RSV, which is respiratory syncytial virus, or malaria, were all developed substantially with challenge trials. And then similarly, vaccines for malaria and typhoid and cholera and flu all have been developed in challenge trials. So the main point here is that challenge studies are used in a lot of different diseases, and they're very, very helpful. So it's a tool that, just generally, like on first principles, if it's silly to not use a tool for this hugely important pandemic that we would really want to use in other contexts. Okay, but the obvious question then is, well, is the risk too high? And so the rough rule of thumb I'm going to give here, we did a study that we've submitted for publication that is kind of looking at, well, if you look at the chance of a 20 to 30-year-old dying from infection who doesn't have comorbidities throughout the entire course of the pandemic, it's probably about 1 in 10,000 roughly. There are other estimates that are lower, but I think that's a useful one to give because it is sort of kind of a higher estimate. And then similarly, the chance of having a severe disease if you don't have comorbidities, if you're 18 to 30, is that would require you being hospitalized, is about 1 in 1,000, maybe 1 in 500. Now, obviously, there's a concern about long COVID, and for that, it's hard to have numbers for that, and that there is significant uncertainty there. But there's two things I'll point out. One is that if you look at there's a COVID app of people reporting their own symptoms. And that found in the population 18 to 30, about 1% of people have some symptom after 3 months, is one thing that maybe can give some guidance here. Okay, so let's sort of focus on this 1 in 10,000 chance of death. What are comparisons to that? So for example, being an astronaut going into space, the risk of dying there is about 1 in 20. Climbing Mount Everest the risk of dying there is about 1 in 100. And so we want to ask, if the risk of dying in mountain climbing in Mount Everest is 100 times greater than the risk of this research, what justifies letting people do that, but not letting people participate in this research? But you might say, oh, well, there's something about medicine that makes it different. And that, another example would be, this is about equivalent to the risk of a woman dying in childbirth in the UK, or it's about 3 times lower than the risk of dying during kidney donation. And the point I want to make is that there are a lot of volunteers who want to take this risk, right? It's not something you're forcing on other people. It's not something you're forcing on desperate people. If you look at the volunteer, we've surveyed at One Day Sooner about 2,000 of our volunteers, and about 40% of them had graduate degrees, so they're well informed. And most of them are willing to take on significantly higher levels of risk than this level of risk. Okay, so then the next two things I want to talk about. First is sort of, if we had developed a challenge model quickly, what would have been kind of realistic and what could we have accomplished? Because it takes time to make the virus up to a standard that you would use for people, and then also to do what's called an infectious dosing study, where you're actually studying that virus and getting the right dose that you would use in a challenge study. And the estimates we've seen, when we had looked at hiring our own labs to do the creation of the virus, about 3 to 4 months. And the study that that Imperial is planning to do for the infectious dosing study is about 2 to 3 months. And the Leiden University study in the Netherlands is also about 2 to 3 months. So imagine there were scientists at the National Institutes of Health in the United States who recommended in early March that we prepare for these studies. So imagine we had done that. And if you think about it, if you do the math, that means we could have started using challenge studies back in September, maybe October. Now, what would that have gotten us if we'd been able to do that? Because I think then we can say, if like that would have clearly been justified. Because imagine if we had efficacy results. Imagine if we knew the effectiveness of not just the Moderna and Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines, but also the Sanofi and Novavax and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. That would be quite useful. Now, it would just be in young, healthy people, but even giving those vaccines only to young, healthy people could be quite valuable. But the other thing we would know is this question of what are called correlates of protection. We might be able to figure this out from a study. So how do you know ahead of time if a vaccine is going to work? Because that could have helped us approve vaccines across a wide range of things without having to wait for the efficacy results, right? And the way that this matters is both, in countries like the US or the UK, getting those vaccine doses available sooner. But it's also about getting vaccines available for the rest of the world. But the other thing, when you look at some of the questions that are now coming up as we're getting vaccine data, it seems obvious that having a challenge model to answer those questions would be really helpful. So for example, with AstraZeneca, they had this result that a half dose, giving the half dose first might lead to 90% effectiveness or efficacy rather than 62% efficacy for 2 full doses. That's a really good thing we'd like to learn more about and learn more about it quickly. You could study that question with a challenge study. Or there's some data from Pfizer that says that only giving 1 dose might be enough to be protective. Again, that would be very valuable to learn in a challenge study. But that also just goes to like, well, if we, it would have been a good idea to develop them for now. But that doesn't totally address the question of, well, okay, now where we are, where there's a plan to develop a challenge study and to do the infectious dosing study, but we really only start testing vaccines in maybe April or something like that. Is that worth it? And I think that the first thing to think about is just thinking about all these uses we've seen so far. It seems obvious that there's going to be other questions that are coming up that are relevant, right? So for example, the question of, does getting vaccinated reduce transmission and not just reduce sickness? Could be answered by a challenge study. That would be really helpful. But also, there's a whole range of scenarios. For example, let's say that we want to be testing vaccines that only require 1 dose or have less side effects than the Pfizer Moderna vaccines. Challenge studies are going to be useful for that, and it's going to be very, very, very difficult to conduct new phase 3s once the existing phase 3s are done, because people are going to be less likely to want to engage in those studies if they know there are other vaccines, and the studies themselves are likely going to need to be larger because there might be less transmission and because you might just compare them to an existing vaccine. So I think there's a wide range of uses for challenge studies, and that they're certainly not perfect, but they're a useful tool for us to study the disease. And there's something that the risk is significant, but there's a lot of people who really want to take, who are well-educated, want to take those risks, and those risks are a lot less than other choices we allow people to make.
Thank you, Josh. It was slightly over time, but I think it's fine. I think we can manage to stay on. And so Charles, if you want to add a few minutes to what you're saying as well, just so it's fair, that's okay. Thank you. So yeah, now we can hand it over to Charles, who will give the against argument for challenge trials.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm really grateful to One Day Sooner and the UCL Bioethics and Medical Law Society for the invitation today. Let me start by saying that I really admire the work that Josh Morrison and One Day Sooner is doing. At its heart, it's an expression of altruism, people coming together to help others. People in more than 160 countries who are saying, I want to be part of the solution. And truthfully, that gives me hope about the future. The debate today is about how best to harness that altruism, whether it is better, say, for people to participate in human challenge studies or traditional vaccine trials. I believe the latter to be a better way to be part of the solution. I believe that it would be unethical to allow volunteers to be infected with wild-type SARS-CoV-2 in challenge studies to develop a vaccine. Challenge studies at present fail ethical requirements for social value, reasonable balance of benefits and harms, and fair participant selection. Let me say something about the first 2 of these, and then I'll end making some points about public trust. So why is the ethics of human challenge studies different When one thinks of research, one typically has a patient randomized trial in mind. A new drug is being tested to see whether it helps patients with a disease. There may be side effects, perhaps even serious side effects, but patients stand to benefit directly from the drug. Human challenge studies are different, though. In a challenge study, healthy people are intentionally made sick to test whether a vaccine works. There is no benefit to the participant of infection. And that is why stricter ethical standards apply and why we're less tolerant of risks. Social value. Challenge studies must demonstrate that the study's scientific ends could not be achieved by traditional means. From March 2020 forward, as we've heard, the motivating claim for challenge studies has been that they will speed the development of a vaccine and thereby save thousands or conceivably millions of lives. That may or may not have been true in March, but it certainly isn't true now. Progress in vaccine development has been extraordinary. By September, there were over 300 vaccine candidates, and at that time, 33 vaccines were being tested in trials, enrolling 280,000 people from 34 countries. By November, we had 3 vaccines that had reported highly promising results, and 3 vaccines have been submitted for regulatory approval. Pfizer's vaccine, which shows 95% efficacy in preventing COVID-19, has been approved for use in the United Kingdom. And as we've heard, vaccinations of people over the age of 80 began today in the UK. So traditional vaccine development has led to a highly effective vaccine. Indeed, it seems likely that we'll soon have multiple vaccines approved, including vaccines suitable for the global south. We don't need challenge studies to develop a vaccine faster or to save lives. There may yet be scientific questions that a challenge study would be useful in answering, but I think it's unlikely that these questions are important enough to expose healthy volunteers to the substantial risks of SARS-CoV-2 infection in the absence of a rescue medication. Benefits and harms. Thousands of volunteers have participated in challenge studies in the last 50 years, and none have died, not one. Scientists only do challenge studies with well-understood diseases that would either resolve on their own or have no long-term harmful effects, or for which curative treatment is available. SARS-CoV-2 is not well understood even now, and what we've learned over the last year shows that the virus's effects may be protean, serious, and long-lasting. The risks associated with SARS-CoV-2 are simply too great to be permitted at present. The virus infects not only the lungs, but the brain, the heart, and blood vessels. Infection of blood vessels leads to blood clots causing kidney failure and strokes. And it also causes inflammation of the heart called myocarditis. And each one of these things occurs in young people. Data from the US state of Indiana through December 1st revealed a hospitalization rate of 2% and a death rate of 0.3% in people aged 20 to 29 years of age who tested positive for the virus. And COVID-19 can lead to long-term disability. And what we know so far is that long COVID results in about 70% of people showing signs of organ damage. How many people are going to develop long COVID? Well, we don't know right now is the best answer, but data from a large UK cohort shows that about 1.5% of people aged 18 to 25 remain symptomatic 8 weeks after infection. And I think that's similar with the figure that Josh referred to. There is no rescue medication. Remdesivir, the drug that was to be made available to challenge study participants, did not reduce mortality in the WHO Solidarity trial. Public trust. Preserving the public's trust is one of the core aims of research ethics. Public trust is also central to the success of COVID-19 vaccination programs. Indeed, it's been said that public health proceeds at the speed of trust. Vaccine hesitancy refers to the reluctance or refusal to vaccinate despite the availability of vaccines. And WHO calls it a top 10 threat to global health. COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy is a major threat. Polling in November revealed that only 52% of Americans and 40% of Canadians plan to get vaccinated as soon as a vaccine is available. And this was after the initial Pfizer announcement. In the United Kingdom, a quarter of Londoners polled in October said that they are unlikely to or definitely won't get a COVID-19 vaccine. Why is that? Well, a subsequent poll in November in the United Kingdom reported many said the pandemic meant there had not been enough time to discover what the side effects of a vaccine may be. So here's the worry. News of the serious injury or death of a healthy volunteer in a challenge study involving a vaccine seems very likely to inflame public trust. Even if SARS-CoV-2 is the cause of the injury, the vaccine will be blamed. This is just the sort of inaccurate message that the anti-vax movement has amplified with social media to great effect. As a result, the public's willingness to get vaccinated may be imperiled just as the first vaccines are being rolled out. SARS-CoV-2 human challenge studies are not ethical at present and should not proceed. Challenge studies need to wait until either there's a rescue medication that reliably prevents progression from mild disease to severe disease, or an attenuated strain of SARS-CoV-2 is available that only causes minor disease, and work on that is in progress. I want to conclude by speaking directly to everyone who's watching who wants to help. You can be part of the solution. You can save lives now. Wear a mask, physically distance, get tested, and volunteer for ongoing vaccine trials. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So now there's some time for Josh and Charles for you guys to ask each other questions about each other's arguments. Josh, would you like to ask Charles a question first, or Charles, would you like to go first?
I can go first. And I guess my question would be, if we had a model available today, so if there'd already been the infectious dosing study, and you could test the AstraZeneca vaccine to see if the half dose were, 90% were much more effective than a full dose. Both, would that be justified? And how do you make the, how do you weigh the benefits of doing that versus the risks to the volunteers?
Yeah, so we don't have a challenge model in hand, right? And it's going to be some months before we do have one. But I take the hypothetical nature of your question. And my answer is no. I don't think it would be ethical to proceed with a challenge study of the low dose AstraZeneca vaccine at this point. And part of the reason is it's really twofold. Part of it is, the sort of risks that I've articulated and long held ethical standards in challenge studies that would be violated by going forward in the absence of a rescue medication. But I think beyond that, the fact of the matter is that we've been much more successful in discovering, creating, and manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines than planned. I mean, you'll well remember from the start of this, regulators were looking for 70% efficacy, and they would accept 50, right? 50. And we have two vaccines now in the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine that are 95% effective. And let's say the AstraZeneca vaccine as well has an overall efficacy of 70%. So I think right now we actually don't need those challenge studies.
That's a good question.
So this is where I ask you a question, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No problem. So Josh, I mean, fabulous presentation. You made a very strong case, but I want to just press you a little bit about one point, and it's something that I mentioned in my talk. How the case for challenge studies was framed at the beginning of the pandemic was really that it would get us a vaccine sooner and would save many lives.
Mm-hmm.
But here we are in December, and people in the United Kingdom are being vaccinated today.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you tell me, how is it that a challenge study now would save many lives?
Yep, that's a great question, because it goes to like what one day sooner means as a concept, right? And one day sooner means not just getting the first vaccine, but it means, and it doesn't mean just ending COVID for the rich and for countries like the US and the UK, but it means ending COVID around the world. And it means reaching everyone throughout the world. And like one way to think of this is just to say that we think that the challenge studies shouldn't be off the table until we're confident that we can vaccinate everyone in the world in 2021. And it might be the case, we certainly hope that it's the case, that every vaccine candidate that's in phase 3 is going to have very high efficacy. And from a doses perspective, then we'll be able to, with the Chinese vaccine candidates and the Russian vaccine candidates, and that we'll be able to vaccinate the world with those vaccines. But we don't know that's going to be true. And then the other thing is there's going to be future needs, even beyond sort of a simple kind of number of doses for places like India or Africa or Brazil. Beyond that, there's a question of distribution. And in particular, right now, almost all the candidates need 2 doses. And mostly there needs to be refrigeration, and that's going to be difficult. And and also, I think if you look at the reactogenicity, if you look at the kind of short-term side effects for Pfizer and Moderna, they're definitely worth taking, but they're going to be relatively significant, and people are from an anti-vaxxer perspective, that's going to be an issue. And so we're going to need to be developing vaccines that are 1 dose, that maybe don't need a refrigeration requirement, maybe have less reactogenicity, maybe have longer duration of immunity. And so I think challenge studies are going to be really useful for that. And I think in particular, some of the studies, I think that, yes, I fully admit that the benefits of these studies are less than we would have thought, than they would have been if we had not had 95% effective vaccines. But it also means the risks in a lot of cases are less as well. And so we can hopefully learn correlates of protection, learn ways to predict if vaccines are going to work or not, by doing challenges in people who've already been infected or who were vaccinated by an effective vaccine. And so the risks go down as well. And if we have that information, that's going to be instrumental for approving vaccines in the future. Oh, I guess I have and so that actually brings my last question. If we do we have time for one more each, or should we go to the audience?
Yeah,
question?
I think it's fine.
Okay. So then also again, ask this question. So imagine about correlates of protection. So imagine a world where we knew if we did a challenge study, let's say in 100 people who were vaccinated, either had been previously infected or had been vaccinated by a fairly effective vaccine. And if we just, let's just assume for the sake of argument that we know that we're going to be able to learn from that a correlate of protection that lets us approve future vaccines based, so we know if they produce this immune response, it's going to work, and then we can approve them as long as they're safe. Would that justify doing a challenge study? And if not, again, how do we weigh the risks, particularly in a population that's either previously infected or vaccinated, where the risks are much less than a largely or completely seronegative the population that hasn't been vaccinated or don't have any antibodies?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think a challenge study that's looking at correlates of protection would be justifiable at this point either. SARS-CoV-2 is not influenza. It doesn't undergo, thank goodness, sort of rapid and antigenic shift, meaning that we're going to have to change the vaccine sort of every season. Thank goodness the structure of this vaccine, on a molecular basis is very, very stable. So, I think that tells us that strategies that go after the spike protein are effective now, and they're likely to remain effective. Let me respond briefly to, because that was a pretty short answer. Let me respond briefly to the issue of getting vaccines to the world. I think that's such an important point. You're absolutely right that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine require specialized freezer storage, and that's not practical globally. But the AstraZeneca vaccine that's demonstrated 70% efficacy, in fact, is well suited for the global south. It's easy to make, it's cheap, and it only requires regular vaccination. All of the vaccines in use today, all or almost all, require refrigeration. And so efforts are underway to build what's called the cold chain. That's the worldwide infrastructure of refrigerators, cool boxes, sensors. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has been investing in this since 2016. And the World Bank has just dedicated $12 billion to purchase vaccines for 2 billion of the world's poorest people, and also to invest in their cold chain. I think the cold chain is sort of more of an issue globally, and I think the AstraZeneca vaccine is our global vaccine right now. I fear my short answer turned into a long one.
I think you can ask.
Can I ask a last question, or would you prefer?
I think one last question, and then we can open up for everyone else's questions.
Thanks very much. So I think a lot of people in the general public have difficulty with science messaging and public health messaging and just kind of understanding these really kind of complicated things that are vaccines. We know that some people think that a vaccine is something where they give you a shot that infects you with the virus. And that's why some people are reluctant to get vaccinated. So there's a difficulty, I think, a real worry about conducting human challenge studies at the same time as we're just rolling out a new vaccination program. And that is, people can get confused about a study, on the one hand, the challenge study that is purposefully infecting people with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the vaccination program on the other hand, that of course isn't infecting anyone with SARS-CoV-2, right? But is trying to prevent infection. So my question is, in the face of a new vaccination program, wouldn't it be better to wait? Wouldn't it be better to wait 6 months, 12 months until that vaccination program is well underway?
So I think this is a great question. I think it raises this sort of long tail, what I might call is kind of the long tail risks of challenge trials that I think are a strong argument against them, which is that there's these different ways that things could go wrong, and in ways that we can't quite quantify, or we don't, there's no evidence, there's no, oh, well, we did challenge trials in this case and it undermined trust in X, Y, and Z way. But that at least theoretically seems possible. And there's also, if something did go wrong, it could damage confidence in the use of challenge studies in the future, or in vaccination, or in vaccine experimentation. And I think that's a very fair point, and it's a very fair concern. But I think that we have to start from, are we we have to start from our own ethical behavior and our own decision to do things that we can explain in a justified way, and then craft the scientific message from there. Because I think the points in public health messaging with COVID that have gone wrong are points where we were trying to kind of outsmart the public in a sense. And we knew that with particularly thinking about with masks in the United States, for example, that we knew that masks might be useful in avoiding transmission in past diseases, but there weren't enough of them, and so we told people not to wear masks. And so I think that but then people were confused because they thought they didn't have to wear masks, but they had to wear masks. And I think that like our lodestar here should be doing what's right and doing what is scientifically accurate, and explaining to people that this isn't that like it's there's a study that's being done over here, and that's different than getting vaccinated over here. And the concern, I mean, I think that why vaccine hesitancy is it's a multifaceted problem, but I don't think we should assume it's because of a sort of simple lack of information, or it's because there was like some rumor that was incorrect about vaccination and that caused vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy has deep, is for one reason just because people, because it provokes side effects and people don't like the side effects and they think, oh my God. And there's a lot of different aspects to it. And so I think being defensive about scientific tools that would be useful is not the right way to combat that, or to approach science communication and public health in general. I think it's just better to be honest and then to be thinking about, okay, how do we explain this clearly, rather than be defensive about how to do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for such insightful questions. I was definitely wondering some of the same things while you were speaking, so thank you. So we've already gotten some questions on the chat. We're running a bit late, but I'm thinking that maybe the breakout rooms, we can leave that till the end, and so people can be free to go or stay depending on whether they want to stay longer or not. I think it's probably better to all like hear these questions and discuss them. So Jeff is asking that for Charles, this question is for Charles. He says, if I understood you correctly, I took you as suggesting that challenge studies should only be used in those situations where other types of trials are not applicable, as opposed to, say, a comparative advantage. Would you be able to say a bit more why you hold this view?
So my position is that SARS-CoV-2 human challenge studies are not currently permissible, and they won't be until we have rescue medication or there's an attenuated strain available. Look, I mean, I absolutely think that, I mean, and Josh has done a great job of outlining a number of important scientific questions that we might address with challenge studies. I have no problem with them being integrated with traditional vaccine studies, but that, from my point of view, is just not ethically permissible until we have basically a rescue medication or an attenuated vaccine. Also, I think we need to be creative about some of the studies that Josh suggested, right? I mean, the idea of doing a transmission study, so we know vaccines now are capable of preventing disease, but there's a lot of asymptomatic transmission, and do they prevent transmission? Josh has suggested that this would be a central role for challenge studies. But I think we can be sort of creative about this and say, well, wait a minute, actually, there's a lot, unfortunately, a lot of asymptomatic transmission on US college campuses. Recent sort of PCR surveys have been done on campuses, for instance, in the state of Indiana, showing a 2% asymptomatic positivity rate. So we can do those challenge studies. We can do those transmission studies now in American college campuses with field trials. We don't need a challenge study to do that, answer that question now.
Thank you. Another point that has come up in the chat is I think there was talk about using second generation vaccines for lower middle income countries. I think maybe it would be good if you could clarify what you mean by a second generation vaccine. Does this mean it's less effective or less safe? Would that be unfair towards lower middle income countries? Could you talk a bit about
Yeah,
that?
so that's a good question. And first, so second generation vaccines should be more effective and more safe than the first generation vaccines. It's not like second best. It's like you develop the first generation, and then you see how those work, and then you develop the second generation basically. Or it can also be, there's kind of this initial wave that was kind of got to their phase 3s more quickly, but then there's other vaccines that in some ways, only the best ones, only the most promising candidates will still make it into that second generation, because if you have a candidate that's, maybe has less of an immune response than the Pfizer vaccine, for example, and there's no other real advantage to it, you might not spend the hundreds of millions of dollars to do a phase 3 for that vaccine. But for example, Merck has a candidate that's a 1-dose vaccine that I think is orally taken. And so that might be really valuable to have. And you might also, I think if you look at, I'm not sure if Novavax will quite count as second generation or first generation. But if you look at the immune response generated by the Novavax vaccine, it's very, very, very high, much higher even than all the other ones we have so far. So yeah, second generation doesn't mean inferior. It just means later, and it should be better. And then also one thing I'll say too is that, we're not advocating for challenge studies in low and middle income countries. We do think that people who are in those countries who are well informed, ideally would have the ability to participate in challenge studies that are being done by experienced trialists, because we think it's helpful from a sort of diversity perspective and making sure you don't have a homogeneous sample, although we've had mixed input from experts of how important that is. But just to be clear, yeah, we wouldn't be suggesting trying, especially disproportionately, to be studying challenge studies with people from low and middle income countries.
Can I jump in and answer that question as well? Yeah, I mean, I'm just adding to what Josh has said. I think the question, that I want to sort of put to that question is, are we even going to need second generation vaccines? I think that's something we need to take seriously at this point. We have 3 effective vaccines in hand, but there are 32 ongoing phase 3 clinical trials. This is the end of the pipeline, largest clinical trial with tens of thousands of people in them, with 32 new vaccines, right? And importantly, so if 30% of those, let's say, turn out to give us an effective vaccine, and historically that is about the positivity rate for phase 3 vaccine trials, we would have 10 new vaccines, or a total of 13. At least 4 of these vaccines that are sort of being tested are inactivated or killed vaccines, and those are generally, this is relative, right? Easy to make and inexpensive, and so those would be a great addition to the AstraZeneca vaccine in terms of meeting global demand.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was really important to clarify. So another question following on from the first question about which context makes challenge trials more acceptable or not. But this is addressed to Josh instead of to Charles. Would you say that challenge studies should be one of the first types of clinical studies that should be used when combating a new outbreak? Or should all other types of clinical trials be considered first and then challenge studies?
So that's a great question, and I think, and the short answer is yes, but it depends. So in my ideal world, and the thing we'd like to advance is that we think that whenever there's a new disease with pandemic potential, it would be valuable to start the kind of viral preparation process and to sort of get things and have the kind of protocol preparation process, so that when you make the ethical decision about whether to move forward with challenge studies, you're able to do it at the earliest stage possible if they're going to be useful. And that doesn't mean that for example, to give an obvious example, with Ebola, it's very unlikely that you would want to do a challenge study with Ebola because the fatality rate is so high. But I do think, I think that it makes sense to have a kind of automatic process that gets us toward, like, in the direction of being able to use these studies early on if they're available. I mean, the obvious, thing that's been in the news a lot lately is the fact that because of the years of preparation, particularly the NIH and other groups have been doing on pandemic preparedness for vaccines and for a coronavirus vaccine, the Moderna vaccine was able to be kind of put together within 2 days of getting the gene sequence of the virus. And that means that we've been testing, we had it available. We've been testing for months and months. And it feels like if you could have a challenge model in place 3 to 4 months after a disease is first noticed. So if we had been able to test efficacy back in May, that seems like it would really have been worthwhile. And so I do think that should be an area of improvement in the challenge field in the future for pandemics.
Thank you. Are you both happy to carry on with questions? There's a lot in the chat, and I think it's probably more useful to have everyone listening to these questions instead of breakout rooms. Yes. Okay, cool. So another question is, what do you think is the probability of ethical approval being given for challenge studies? Apparently the WHO were discussing this yesterday. I don't know who it's addressed to. I guess maybe you could both give your input. Maybe I think Charles might be better suited to answer this.
You can go
well, I'd love to hear Josh's view on this too. Yeah, I mean, there are 3 challenge studies that are being designed, put together, 2 in the United Kingdom, 1 in the Netherlands, and they've been creating, as I read sort of in the press, they've been creating sort of pure strains of wild type SARS-CoV-2, but none, to my knowledge, has yet achieved ethics approval. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what's going to happen. I guess I kind of focus on what should happen, and I just there is a long-standing sort of rule in human challenge studies that's kept us safe, and by us I mean the scientific enterprise, society, but most importantly, research participants. And that is that scientists don't do challenge studies unless they're dealing with a well-understood organism that's either self-limited or for which there's reliably curable, there's rescue medication, right? And that's how we've been operating for the last 50 years. Now is not the time for pandemic exceptionalism. Now is not the time to sort of, throw our ethical framework out the window. I think we need to stick with what's kept us safe and what's kept science responsible. And so I'll just say that at the moment, I do not believe that any of these 3 studies should receive ethics approval.
Yeah, and I think just to quickly, so first, I do think this point about, does this fit with past practice? I think that, to me, the question is more about absolute risk, because I think that, for flu or for RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, those diseases can be deadly in young people. They are just they're less likely to be deadly than COVID, and they're quite unlikely to be deadly. But the question to me isn't, can a disease be deadly? Because those diseases can be, and we do challenge studies with them all the time, but is the absolute risk, is that worth the benefit? And now in terms of the question of will there be ethical approval, I think that it's like, yeah, we've been thinking about this a lot at One Day Sooner and trying to make some guesses, and it really is just a guess at this point. And I think, and I also wouldn't I wouldn't assume that because something does or does not get ethical approval, that to me wouldn't be the first analysis of is it a good idea or not? Because I think that my honest opinion is that I think it's likely that the UK studies will get ethical approval, but that's partly because because there's a lot of institutional backing for those studies. These are studies that were developed by the UK Vaccine Task Force. They've been sort of endorsed or been there's been public support across a wide range of different media. And it's actually quite interesting as an American, because in the United States, the powers that be, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, have been pretty skeptical and are ultimately this point opposed to challenge studies. And the conversation in the United States has taken a very different turn than the conversation in the United Kingdom. And so I think, people's intellectual and their ethical determinations about things are also related to power dynamics. And so I think my guess is that you'll see the studies approved in the UK. I don't think that's a certainty, because I do think that I do think that there remain a lot of strong uses for them post the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca results, but those results do weaken the case for them, or at least it certainly reduces the benefits for them. So I would expect I think that it's more likely than not that you'll see approval in the UK. I don't have an intelligent opinion about what you'll see in the Netherlands. They might approve if the UK approves again, but yeah, that's just my prediction going forward, and it really could go either way, I think.
So Josh, you've raised a really important point, and I hope it's okay, and it's because it's a new point that you raised about our use of RSV and influenza challenge trials. You've said that they're both potentially deadly diseases, and so this seems to be an exception to the rule that I articulated about when we can ethically do challenge studies. So that's very, very central to my case. So I hope it's okay, moderator, if I just briefly respond to that. So look, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, can cause serious disease in young children. It causes bronchiolitis, but in adults, it causes the common cold. It does not cause serious disease in adults, and that's the only population that the RSV challenge model is used. Influenza, of course, kills many, many people globally. I mean, a shocking number of people die each year, and particularly in bad flu years. But people actually die of secondary infections. So primary influenza pneumonia, sort of primary viral pneumonia, is actually very, very rare. It's that secondary infection, that pneumonia on top of the influenza that you get. Influenza challenge strains obviously don't use pandemic influenza, and they also don't use years where there's bad influenza, right? So they purposely select the absolute mildest strains of influenza for use. So mild, in fact, that again, there is no risk of severe illness with those challenge strains. They're so mild, in fact, that antiretrovirals for influenza, which exist, aren't used in these studies.
Thank you. So a big theme that's been going on in the chat, and I think people would like you to maybe talk about, Charles, is how can you justify, the number of lives that would be lost in the time before everyone in the world is vaccinated, not just people in the UK and in other rich countries. How can you justify that loss of life against the smaller risk of people, of people suffering from the side effects of a human challenge trial when they've willingly taken those risks for themselves in an informed way? So there's been a few people asking about that.
Well, I'm very glad that they did ask that. Look, there was a case at the beginning of this pandemic to sort of say, look, one way we might get ahead of this faster through the use of human challenge studies, and maybe that would get us a vaccine sooner. That's not where we're at today. We have 2 vaccines in hand that are 95% effective. They prevent 95% of COVID-19, and we have a 3rd vaccine that's 70% effective that would be highly suitable for global distribution. As I've mentioned, we've got another 32 vaccines in the pipeline. Challenge studies do not eliminate the need for those phase 3 studies. So even if we did, a phase 3 study, a challenge trial of a, say, novel vaccine, we would still need to do that large phase 3 study. Where we're at today with 3 effective vaccines in hand and more coming, very likely, is that we're really facing a new problem, and it's not the creation of a safe and effective vaccine. We have several. The problem we face today is vaccine manufacturing and the global distribution of those vaccines. That's what's going to save lives. We're going to save lives by increasing our manufacturing capacity for making the effective vaccines that we have in hand. And we're going to save lives through the global distribution, the fair and equitable global distribution of these vaccines, including the AstraZeneca vaccine. So if we want to save lives, we need to invest in manufacturing, and we need to invest into global distribution. If we start doing human challenge studies in January as proposed, the number of doses in hand of a novel vaccine that we're going to have by the end of 2021 as a result of challenge studies is 0. The way to save lives is manufacturing and global distribution.
This point relates to this, and it was mentioned in some previous comments. Do you think that a new vaccine candidate might make manufacturing and production easier than the 3 vaccine candidates that are almost there in terms of efficacy? Or do you think this isn't really a big consideration to take into account?
So I can say something briefly about that. Yeah, I think it would be very useful to have an inactivated or killed vaccine. Fortunately, there are 4 at the end of the pipeline completing large phase 3 trials. I sincerely hope that one of those proves to be safe and effective. That would be a great addition globally to the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Thank you. Another question which is very relevant, it's quite long, but I'll just read. If volunteers know the risk of undertaking a challenge trial and they're not being paid to participate, and there's no coercive forces on them, is it even a question whether we should permit them to enter a human challenge trial if they are willing to participate, and if there is value to having a human challenge trial? I guess it's a very moral question. I think you've touched upon it before.
A very good question, I might add. Is that one sort of for both of us, or?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting if you could both just give a response to it.
Do you want to start, Josh?
Sure. So I think that I think consent is necessary but not sufficient, and I think the right standard to me is, do people, there's both informed consent, and is there a clear reason to believe the benefits of this study outweigh the risk, right? And I think in this case, when you have this massive pandemic, even a small chance of answering kind of basic scientific questions would justify that, given that there are well-informed people to be in these studies. And particularly, uses of a study of, sort of what someone mentioned in the chat of like immunologic bridging to try to figure out, because I think that could lead to approval, and could lead to approval of vaccines that are like one dose, for example, so are much easier to distribute. So yeah, I think that the consent piece is very important. And the last thing I'll mention, in part because it's been in the news this week, is I think that partly to make that consent real, it's important that that people who are research participants be involved in the design of these studies and the approval of the studies themselves. I think that's something that has not been a part of kind of research ethics to date. But I think hopefully if anything comes, if the only thing to come of One Day Sooner and the COVID-19 is, and the idea of COVID-19 challenge studies is getting research participants to have our voices heard with, actually in the design of the studies. I think that's a useful element of our work, and I'd be proud of it.
So that was a great answer. I mean, Josh said that consent is necessary but not enough. Harm benefit has to be there, and also that there ought to be meaningful community engagement. And I just want to agree with all of those points. I mean, I think and where Josh and I are disagreeing is kind of on the harm benefit question, right? And so I think that's important to emphasize. The questioner, though, I mean, I suspect the questioner might not be on the same page. I don't know, but might not be on the same page. Some people think, let me put it that way. Some people think that, look, if you've got consent, right, and it's good enough, then why be paternalistic, right? I mean, if people are informed, right, then just let them do it. And I think the answer to that question is that paternalism isn't bad if it's justified. And it can be, paternalism can be justified even if people give fully informed consent. It can be justified when individual choice interferes with the duties of another, right? So for instance, just to take a silly example, the consent of someone to be a living sort of heart donor, right? Actually violates the physician's duty to her patient, right? And there are also cases where individual choice might involve harm to others. And so those are kind of the two broad cases where you might think paternalism can overrule consent. And what I'm saying is that SARS-CoV-2 challenge studies violates the obligation of physician researchers basically to do no harm. At this point in time, without a rescue medication, they simply aren't safe enough to do. And so consent is not enough.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time and that it's already 5 minutes past. There's a lot of other questions. Are you happy to continue, or should we wrap it up?
I do 5 more minutes, but
Okay.
yeah, we'll also wrap it up with this.
Sounds good.
Cool. So we'll take last 2 questions maybe. There was a question about like moving forward. Should there be a protocol for challenge trials for like a next pandemic? It says it may be worse still. There may be much greater difficulty in developing vaccines. So would this be something useful? What is your take?
Yeah, briefly, I mentioned this before, but that we definitely think there should be, and we think it could be quite valuable. And I do think, it shows how much worse things could have been when you think about, oh, there's this 95% effective or multiple 95% effective candidates, and it's like, great, hopefully by summer things will be back to normal. And you think, wow, it's like that's a long time until things come back to normal. And so, it could have really been much worse than this if early vaccine candidates had failed altogether, for example. And that's why we do think it's important to have a kind of more automatic system for the use of challenge studies in pandemic circumstances. And then the other thing I would add to that is that I also feel, apart from the challenge study preparation in general, I think that spending more of our energy as a society or as a civilization on fighting infectious disease is, this shows how important it is. So I think investing a lot more resources into like universal flu vaccine, and also, there's also the idea of trying to do, to look at all the different viral families that could cause pandemics, and to be developing vaccines for each of them ahead of time, and to actually do the phase 1s to test their safety ahead of time, so that when there's a pandemic, you can almost skip right to the phase 2 and the later studies. So I think those would also be really useful steps that we should keep in mind.
So, there's so much that we need to do better for next time. And I'm sorry to say this, but there will be a next time, and probably fairly soon. We need to step up considerably our investment in global surveillance for novel pathogens. That's enormously important. We need a robust infrastructure for that. We need each of the countries that we live in needs to invest more money in our public health infrastructure. One of the things we've all learned here is that we can have a great system with hospitals and doctors, but that just isn't the same as having a strong public health infrastructure. I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but just look at what happened in the United States. The United States has a world-class health system, but it does not have a world-class public health system. And so we need investments on that front. There's all kinds of preparedness we can do in terms of ventilators and PPE and looking at supply chains, domestic manufacturing of vaccines, domestic manufacturing of PPE. What we saw here, certainly from my perspective in Canada, was that as soon as other countries began to run into trouble with drugs used in ICUs or PPE, suddenly our supplies going across the border dried up. So there's lots we need to do. I'm not convinced that challenge studies are a central part of that solution. If there's a lesson from 2020 and the coronavirus pandemic, it's that traditional vaccine development worked exceptionally well.
Thank you. And just one last question. So thinking about where we're at right now, with governments beginning to think about rolling out mass vaccination programs, and combating all the misinformation around not like general vaccines only, but this vaccine and all the misgivings. Thinking about public trust, one of the comments on the chat is this just one of many considerations? How much weight should we give to this consideration? Is there any empirical evidence backing how participation in clinical research on these harms affect public opinion? But there are also other comments that say that that they believe this is a really big consideration that needs to be taken in mind. So it's interesting to see how we all perceive this and the effect that this can have. I guess it would be good to know if there is any empirical work on it, and if there's no empirical work that you know of, how much of a consideration do you think this should be?
Well, we have lots of empirical work in terms of polling data, and I think what we can say is that COVID vaccine hesitancy is a very serious issue. We can have the most effective vaccines in the world, and indeed we have highly effective and safe vaccines in hand. But if people aren't willing to take them, we're simply not going to be able to put the coronavirus pandemic in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, and I would add, I don't think there's very much kind of empirical research on the connection of challenge studies to potential vaccine hesitancy or trust or things, or even on like accidents in studies in general and vaccine hesitancy. But I think some things, there was some polling and survey work done by a group at UC Berkeley that were kind of pretty pro-challenge. And so that wasn't perfect, but that found that if people feel like if it's going to be helpful in leading to faster development, people were pretty supportive of challenge studies. Now, how does that affect vaccine hesitancy? It's unclear. But so there's really not, I think it would be useful to have some of these science communication discussions more empirically informed, although it's just a little bit, thinking about how you figure that out experimentally is hard. The last thing I'll just mention, just to get a chance to plug one of our ideas that's not a challenge study idea. So one of the campaigns that One Day Sooner started working on is to do a vaccine day. We're focused right now in the United States. We think lots of countries could use a vaccine day. So this would be a national holiday where everyone would get off work, and it would be about celebrating the vaccine. So people can get vaccinated that day, but it's also a day to encourage, it's also a day to, people who've been vaccinated can then go out and celebrate, and hopefully everyone can celebrate. And so creating a positive association and kind of a public focus on it. And so we're working with some of our kind of steering committee members, or people like Stanley Plotkin, or former Surgeon General Richard Carmona, Norman Baylor, who used to run vaccines at the FDA, Congressman Matt Cartwright, and a number of other folks. So including people who are against challenge studies like Angie Rasmussen, and people who are in favor like Mark Lipsitch. And so that's an area that we're working on. And if people want to work on that either in their own country or in the US, we would love to hear from them and work together on that.
Thank you. That's very interesting to know. So yeah, there were like a lot of other questions, but I think kind of resonating along the same themes. And I think we've had a really good discussion. So thank you both so much. It's been, I found it very interesting. To be honest, I wasn't really made up in terms of, am I for, am I against? And I'm still not really made up. It's a really interesting debate though, from a bioethical point of view, from a social point of view, economic. There's just so many considerations. So thank you.